MINDFUL dot MOMENTS17 at gmail.com. As you know, we have dedicated May and June, as well as April, to the COVID-19 pandemic. And we will be continuing this series because we think it's very relevant to what is going on in our country. You know, what's interesting today is that the House is getting ready to introduce a bill, bipartisan bill, that will create a national public health corps. And this is intended to hire a large number of unemployed people to conscript them to begin to do the testing and the contact tracing that is so sorely needed within our country. And this will also improve the economy because we will be bringing people back to work. What's also of importance is that these states are now opening up without any restrictions, not following the CDC guidelines for restrictions at all. And so we in the healthcare profession believe we're going to see, well, we know we're going to see an increase in the amount of people becoming infected. You know, the White House now is no longer immune themselves from infections from COVID-19 or the SARS-CoV-2 virus itself. You've got 23 employees who have recovered. You've got 60 who are currently on quarantine. You've got over 11, maybe more, Secret Service officers who have worked the White House who themselves are now testing positive for COVID-19. And you have Dr. Fauci, who is the director of allergy and infectious diseases himself, has put himself on self-quarantine and only coming in at night when people are not at the
Dad Belvin.
To please continue the physical distancing, wearing the mask, the gloves, and doing your best to mitigate the need to have to go to the hospital, because we now know that there are going to be some rationings of care and rationings of service. So I'm not going to prolong this, and I'm getting ready to introduce a guest that I am just so happy to have join us on the show today, Dr. Denise Shervington, who is a longtime friend and colleague. She's currently the chairperson of the Department of Psychiatry at Charles R. Drew Medical Center University in Los Angeles, California. Dr. Shervington, are you with us?
Yes, I am, and thank you so much, Dr. Newton. It's always a pleasure and an honor to have conversations with you. I always learn so much.
Well, we learn from each other. So would you please take a moment and maybe you may need to speak up just a little bit, but please take a moment to tell our listening audience about who you are, what you do, how you've come into this whole arena around trauma and disaster medicine and psychiatry, so they can know that we're dealing with a real expert this morning.
Okay, well, I always say that, you know, if you are a psychiatrist, and in our era where you had to do psychotherapy and not just medication management, you already have a lot of experience with trauma. It's nothing new, even though it's become sexy in the past 10 or 15 years. So beginning there, and over the years in my career, when I worked in HIV disease in New York at Columbia, so much of the work around HIV and the African American community was around unresolved traumas, usually adversities in childhood. I worked at the VA, worked with men who went to war, particularly with African American Vietnam vets and their traumas before and after the war. And then when I came back to New Orleans after Katrina, it was a really unfortunate situation in that the human issues in a post-disaster environment, what was needed to address the post-traumatic stress disorders, the depression, the substance use in adults, the violence in the household, all those things we know happen after disasters. There was no plan in place. So I started working with my nonprofit organization here in New Orleans, which had been totally decimated, and I was trying to help them to come back. I just decided that I had to fill the gap that the mental health, the public mental health systems, and the academic systems in mental health were not addressing the issues of trauma in African American communities in a post-disaster environment, and in particular focused on children. And as a result of that work over the years, last year before Congressman Elijah Cummings passed away, 3 months before, he invited me to give testimony before the Committee on Oversight and Reform on Childhood Trauma in Disaster Environments. He was very passionate about trauma, and together with Congresswoman Ayanna Presley had this day here in addressing trauma in multiple ways, adversities, the ACEs, the opioid epidemic, what happens in communities of color with inequities. Yeah, and in my role at Charles Drew University, trying to look again at how trauma, early adversities, ongoing systemic inequities, community trauma, how that really plays out and impacts our physical and mental health.
And you also did work in Japan after the nuclear reactor incident, isn't that correct?
Yes, so I went after the tsunami in 2011. Now it happened. The tsunami happened March 11th in northern Japan primarily, and the Japanese had been coming to New Orleans after Katrina to say, "Hey, we'll help you all figure out how to manage disaster," because they consider themselves a culture of disaster. Almost every year there is some natural disaster happening in Japan and the islands around. And so they came to New Orleans around 2008, and they were helping us figure out how, as a community, do we look at issues of trauma, being prepared, disaster preparedness, managing. And then, lo and behold, 3 years later, the tsunami happened, and they asked us, please come. They felt that as prepared as they were for trauma, this one was so overwhelming, because not only did you have the tsunami, you then had the nuclear disaster. They just wanted us, our presence there, again, tapping into African American culture. They wanted a group of musicians to come. They're very into jazz. And so we traveled northern Japan, really just being a soothing element. I was invited as a psychiatrist to address some of the stories of trauma that people were sharing. And even though I do not speak Japanese, it was an amazing sense of connectedness. And, as human beings, we're all one. And so that really has impacted how I think about disasters and trauma from going forward from that experience.
And so today we're going to be highlighting mental health framework for managing during disasters. And I guess we need to find out what your feeling is about this COVID-19 and this disaster impact that is affecting not only the United States but globally, and also particularly African Americans.
You know, Dr. Patty, you probably are more studied in this than I, but just the ongoing impact, the unresolved trauma of slavery through current days and all the negatives since, and the way in which it's impacted our health or lack of access to health systems, to wealth systems. We know it's all connected, your health and your wealth, your education, all of that has negatively impacted us over the years. So when you have a virus, as we know, the virus not racist, but the systems of testing and treatment are extremely racist. I'm just going to call a state a state.
All right.
From African Americans going into testing sites and not being able to get tested, even though they've had all the symptoms, to then going into hospitals and getting suboptimal care oftentimes. And then the focus now, and we have all these underlying conditions. Yeah, we have them, but so do a lot of white people. And they're not dying at the rate that we are. So, you know, this has just really exposed the inequities that didn't start when they decided to use the terms health disparities and inequities. They've been with us since slavery, since our bodies have been experimented upon or we were thought lesser than. And I see now we have this existential collective crisis. Who are we in America and how do we want to be and how do we chart our course forward? Because the powers are not going to care for us in the way that we needed to be cared for as a population within the United States.
And with that in mind, what do you see as being manifested among African Americans in terms of their mental and behavioral well-being during this pandemic?
Yeah, so you know, initially we started off with a lot of denial. I actually have a friend who I walk with, or used to walk with every morning, and at the beginning, she was not listening to the messages because she said, I just cannot go through another Katrina here in New Orleans. This pandemic has reawakened all the anxieties and fears that Black people had about the disaster. And it wasn't until the people around her started getting infected and dying that she started to really take seriously the prevention messages that we have. So a lot of us come into this with a lot of wanting to avoid another painful experience. We've had so much pain in our lives, so much trauma, that this initially was just, we can't deal with this. There was even the mythology that somehow the virus would not impact or affect Black people, and some of us believed that for a while. And here we are, perhaps, now having to deal with, we are the ones who are dying. We are the ones who are most at risk, beginning again from our economic situation that puts so many of us on the front line in the healthcare system, in the food systems, in the factories. We are now the ones at the highest disaster, pre-disaster risk. That's always been our situation, whether it's a natural disaster, whether it's war. Once they started taking us in the military, they will put us in the front lines in the most dangerous jobs. So we always have the most disaster risk. And usually we die at increasing rates. And we're going to have to wake up. You know, some of our past leaders, they have tried to let us, to make us aware that we only survive if we are collective as individuals, which is what I think integration lulled some of us into thinking, that we just needed to get the right education, get enough money, and we would be fine, we would be Americans. I don't think so. And so who are we? You know, to me, this is the existential dilemma we're facing. Who are we as Americans, and how do we forge forward?
Now, you are between Los Angeles and New Orleans, do you see any response differences among African Americans between those two cities, or is the psychology about the same?
I think, so I happen to be at the medical school in Los Angeles, that its mission is social justice, it's a HBCU. It also is a Hispanic serving institution, so we share the issues of oppression with or Latinx population. And so in that institution, we have taken a very aggressive role in really trying to address the community. We're in Compton, we are close to Watts. This is how the university sees itself. So there's a lot of attempt to educate the community. We got one of the testing sites, because there was a testing site desert in California, as you can imagine, and there was, because of a really good person on the board of supervisors that cares about the African American community, there was a real aggressive attempt to educate and test in the African American community that I'm familiar with there. I think in New Orleans, they're not black healthcare systems, and the one hospital we had with an amazing black woman CEO, she has always had to fight for resources. But when in the height of the dying and deaths from COVID, suddenly everybody wanted to send patients to her hospital. So even though we're a black city here in New Orleans, we don't necessarily have the economic power, and we don't control as much, except we do have a black mayor who's had to fight her way through the powers that be. The wealth in New Orleans still resides with white people. And so you see the struggle that we see in the South of predominantly black African American city with some seeming political power, but not the economic power. And so the fight that the mayor has to engage in to try to extend the stay-at-home, shelter-at-home, stay-at-home, however we want to call it, ordinance, the business people started to attack her because they're not dying. It's us on the front lines who go into their businesses and make money for them who are dying. So they want to get us back out. So there's not that much difference, except when you have communities where there is leadership, black leadership, that is willing to go and fight for us.
Mm-hmm. In terms of the death rate that we are seeing among the African Americans in this country, do you feel that this is, as some people are alluding to, this is a systematic plan, or how is it affecting the people's mentality in terms of their perception of how the government is treating the disparities that exist in the death rate?
Dr. Pat, I would say there has always been a plan to not really fully support our survival, except that at various times we have been important to the economy of the United States, or really to the Western world. When we become a problem, they quickly can allow us to, I'll take the least aggressive position, that they allow us to suffer versus they're making us suffer. But you probably know where my mind is. That we've always been abandoned. Our needs, our health, our wealth has never been prioritized. So I think it's just part of what has existed for the over 300-400 years. We have been enslaved. What I hope we will do, and maybe I'm Jamaican, and probably some channeling Marcus Garvey to some extent. It's like we're
a good one to channel, for sure.
I know. It's like we're going to have to begin to assert more agency over our lives, and it has to be collective. We cannot do this by our own. And the late Walter Shervington used to say that, integration was a one-way street into whiteness. He grew up in segregation, in segregated Baltimore, and he thought there were much more protective factors in his experience as a child in segregation. We cared more for each other. There was collective purpose. Even when you had more means, his father was a doctor, but his father was as connected to the postman and the numbers man. They all saw themselves as having some collectivity. We've lost that. We isolate ourselves. We think integration means that we're being treated fairly. I mean, I'm always surprised when African American professionals doing well materially come to me, they're depressed, whatever, and their realization that the world is unfair and inequitable. The younger ones, and I'm going, really? How did we stop letting you know that nothing much has changed, except that a few of us have had access to materialism and wealth? Few wealth, but some of us enough money to think that we have money.
In this climate, and in conjunction with what you just said, there appears to be a lot of denial, not only in terms of, I'm not talking about that COVID is real, but in terms of how we're going to cooperate as a people, as a community, as a nation, community of people of color, of black people, of African people. How are we going to be able to come together and realize that nobody's going to help us, that we're going to have to be doing for self as the world goes? What's your take on that, and what suggestions do you have in terms of how we can begin to change the mindset of a people who have continued to be enslaved despite some of their financial acumen?
So, I think we have to elevate voices like yourself that have been, at times removed from what seemingly is the mainstream. We see the same thing happened to Dr. Frances Cress Welsing. Those amongst us who have tried to create some sense of our own self-determination and the power in being collective, a lot of those voices amongst us have gotten marginalized. That's so-and-so. Why do we call the ways we speak about those who are trying to tell us we have to be responsible for ourselves. And I was on a webinar with several black physicians this past Saturday. These were physicians in Texas. And these are younger. I was the oldest. I'm in my 60s. These are the young black women physicians in their late 30s, 40s. And I was really pleased to hear them giving a message of we, as a community, we need to want to see a black doctor. We are just as highly trained. We're no less highly trained than the average white physician. Yet, for some reason, sometimes I think we are more comforted. We think that the white institutions, the white doctors are much more competent than we are, and we're going to have to go back to trusting ourselves, each other, and to support each other. So, as a psychiatrist, I think I am going to elevate my voice around, in spite of all the external forces that are coming at us. How do we resist them? I know some of us have to work to dismantle that, but in the meantime, the damage that they've done to our psyche, and that's been written about since Frantz Fanon and beyond him. How do we reclaim our own sense of our own humanity, our value, our worth in a society that tries to tell us we're not fully worthwhile? How do we love ourselves? How do we care for ourselves? How do we question and manage our emotional space? Oftentimes we don't do that. We've come, and I'm not knocking religion, but sometimes I'll just give up and say we're going to pray. Sometimes you have to push through the prayer and do things for yourself. And so I think we're going to have to get out there and be willing to be a little more on the revolutionary side as we used to be. I think integration took some of that out of us, and we're going to have to get back to some of those old ways. Is how I think we're going to make it through this, where we have to see ourselves as being there for each other.
Yeah, in your statement, you said, I'm reminded of the phrase, "Oh, I'm just going to leave it to the Lord." But when I grew up in the South, I was told that God helps those who help themselves. And so I think what you're simply saying is that we have to reclaim what, in fact, we already knew. We have to bring it forth in our immediate consciousness and not have it be so dormant as it has been in the past, because people are afraid, and people are afraid, particularly during these times of loss of their job. Well, they've lost them anyway because of COVID-19, but, people are not willing to come out and take a stand for what is right and what is moral and what is decent and human, because they are thinking more of, their financial security, their food, their clothing, and their shelter. So what kind of recommendations or comments would you like to make to those people who are afraid of their own shadows?
Yeah, I always say in a disaster, fear is our friend. And maybe we've always been in disasters, metaphorically, so maybe we've always had to have some fear. But we need to be able to manage it. We need to be able to understand, how do I acknowledge fear? How do I not become, we love to jump into hope and optimism and faith because we feel so powerless. We have to see that power in ourselves to imagine a way of being. If the slaves hadn't done that, he would still be enslaved and picking cotton. They had to step outside of their own fear to say, let me imagine a way that I can begin to gain freedom. And I think we have become so distracted from the pain inside of us, the fear, the anger. We're not as in tune with our minds and our bodies as I think we need to be strong, so that it can help us figure out how to survive, how to be resilient and move through. If we could have made it out of slavery, we can make it out of this, is my feeling right now. We can all figure out how we can be Miss Harriet Tubman in our own lives and figure out how we're going to save not only ourselves, but take a few people with us. And we've lost that. We lost that sense of collectivity, and we're going to have to try to reconnect with it. It's somewhere dormant inside.
Mm-hmm.
To me, fear can be a teacher as to, I think it's Thich Nhat Hanh, the Buddhist priest, who says, no mud, no lotus. So suffering is a part of life, but how do we not suffer, and how do we gain strength and figure out a pathway to freedom?
What about the educational system in America? What is the role of that, and do you believe in the concept of perhaps having, in addition to the regular school, an alternative school like some groups do in the United States, where you're actually instructing our people on who they are, what their role is, and that kind of thing? Give us some comment on that in terms of how that helps us with resilience as we create a new generation coming forward to handle disasters of this type.
Yeah, we know, when I grew up in Jamaica, there was the Chinese subgroup in Jamaica. Their kids went to the usual schools, and then they had Chinese school afterwards, where they learned about their culture, they learned how to be proud, how to support each other. And now they're one of the wealthiest ethnic groups in Jamaica, because they, through that kind of collectivity, they were able to build wealth, and or just build their own sense of their value and worth. I am all for, again, I'm stealing from Walter Shervington, the late Walter Shervington, who used to say, we have to bust our children into blackness. Again, with integration, we've gotten removed from seeing ourselves, even seeing the black teachers who cared about us. That's the problem we have here in New Orleans. The educational system sucks. It does not educate children in a way that will make them succeed. Poor black children are not getting the education that they need. They're not being taught how to think. They have young Teach for America folks who are just trying to get to their next educational level to get a free master's degree and beyond. And so we have to acknowledge that the system is broken and figure out how we can help ourselds, how we can teach ourselves. A lot of education actually should start in the home. So simple things we can do, and when I talk to parents is, you don't have to immediately go home. You have to cut on the TV. You have to get off your phone. You have to have at least 30 minutes with your child to just listen to them, to increase their curiosity and their interest in learning. Whatever we need to do, we have to see ourselves as the first teachers. And those educators who are in a position to have extra and alternative culturally reinforcing activities, I'm all in support, because the general public educational system is not here to make us scholars. We succeed in spite of the systems that are set forth. And New Orleans is a perfect example. I'm very involved here in the educational system around trauma in our youth. Just got off a call yesterday about how we reimagine an educational system in New Orleans that actually educates our children.
So what do you think would prohibit that? Do you think the powers that be would not be, quote, pleased, end of quote, with African people beginning to empower themselves to the degree that they can become self-sufficient and proud and resilient?
Sometimes I think in true American way, and I've never seen it happen, as I compare myself as a black leader versus my colleagues who are white. And by that I mean in the nonprofit that I ran in New Orleans. In order for me to get resources, my proposals had to be so tight. I would remember white colleagues would say, oh, so-and-so, I'm going to get $500,000. Let's think about how we might plan to use it. We've never been in that position. The resources don't come and seek us out. So
that's right.
I think we have to stop thinking that we can only do things when we have access to a lot of resources. So very few of us do that. And then when we have a little bit of wealth amongst us, or black wealthy folks barely look back and say, let me help you out. Few do, but not to the extent. And then you don't want me to talk about when the men succeed and they have to find non-black women to marry. We won't talk about it. We won't have that conversation.
Maybe we should. Okay.
So, I think that we have to figure out how, with what we have, we can do, and not to the extent we burn ourselves out. But there are probably more things I could do to help to educate some black children. We can see ourselves in more leadership roles in our communities, and with more a responsibility to help others. I think we're doing it better, but we could do more. We could have those spaces. And, in my nonprofit, we put a lot of energy into being present with the young people around their mental health. I could have made much more money in my earlier career if I just did the usual, being a doctor, whatever doctors do. But, and I'm not there are many people like me, I'm sure you do that. We can give back, and it doesn't always have to be money. It could be the ways in which we have knowledge that we can impart, that we can mentor, and that we can help other people. That's how we succeeded in segregation. Everybody bartered what they had, and we built strength, and we did build power.
How do you think this miseducation system is affecting us in terms of we have more people, brown and black, going into the criminal justice system, and now they're dying at alarming rates of COVID-19. Do you see us creating an educational system that is protective against this whole entry into the criminal justice system? Again, I guess I'm talking about primary health prevention here. What's your take on that?
Could you clear that up for me? Are you saying primary health or education? I'm sorry.
No.
True Sage Life Insurance.
To improve the quality of our lives, and our health is included in that. That's what I'm asking.
I got you. Yeah. Myself and many others, and I'm speaking from my statement, we have to challenge the things that we have control over that end up in our children in educational spaces. Behaviorally showing behaviors that are considered aggressive and push them into the criminal justice system, because as psychiatrists, mental health providers, we know that how children display their emotional dysregulation is through their behaviors. So some of the things that are happening in our homes, in our communities, we have to insist that when children are traumatized, that they get mental health care. As an adolescent psychiatrist in my early career, I ran at the time, and you might remember that they were like residential group homes that were kind of quasi medical, because it was kind of a hospital but a step down, and we could have adolescents in for like 6 months to a year. These are all white children. When they had problems in school, they got sent into the mental health system. When our kids have problems in school, which is just a reflection of trauma that's happening, whether it's in the home or out in the neighborhood, then our kids get sent into the juvenile justice system. And so we have to try to prevent, and we have to also try to dismantle these systems. This is a lot of the work that I've done in New Orleans, is that our children are sad, they're not bad. So when, and I'll put in air quotes, when they're acting out, they're asking for help. We need to approach them with compassion, with restorative approaches, with mental health supports. We don't need to begin to criminalize them in the juvenile justice system. And that's a fight that we're having in many cities. It's not just New Orleans, is wherever there's a large black and brown population. Our kids are not allowed to have one little mistake in their lives. They never get the benefit of the doubt. It is always, let's get them, their problems, they're bad, let's put them into the criminal justice system. And then when we put them there, we do nothing to help to be rehabilitated. They don't get the services they need. They barely get educated, and so we just continue to perpetuate the adult the adult criminal justice system.
Mm-hmm. And unfortunately, in terms of, I was taken by the fact that as the states have mandated that people wear masks in public, and when our African American young men start to wear masks, they are being confronted by security guards and police and that kind of thing about taking them off because it's automatically assumed that they're going to be there to rob something. And so you can't even obey the law without being harassed because of who you are. And I guess are you suggesting that parents, or parents or anybody in the community begin to have more advocacy, because we need to be able to change things at the local level, not just wait for the presidential election, but things change at the local level. What suggestions from an emotional, mental, psychological advocacy rehabilitation model do you suggest?
Yeah, so, here in New Orleans, we did a whole public will talk about advocacy in my nonprofit. We engaged in and continue to a 3-year public will campaign, and the hashtag is Sad Not Bad, really highlighting the traumas that our kids experience in cities or states that do the adverse childhood experiences screening. And we now know Philadelphia gave us more than just what's happening in the household, what some of the community factors that lead to trauma in kids, like racism, like being in foster care, discrimination, violence. When you add that up, we have more. Normal, you don't have a child, see someone getting shot, close to them and say, okay, you get over it. No, that child needs some mental health intervention. I have so many stories of that. Yeah, and we just keep it moving. I mean, this is something we love to say. You just got to keep it moving. Sometimes you have to slow down and deal with the pain, so you have to move through it. You can't get to the other side of it until you move through it. So we have got to reclaim our mental well-being, that when bad things happen to us, and they will, we have to take the time to process them, to learn from them, move through them, and that's what true resilience is. You can't just keep going like it never happened. So those kind of things amongst ourselves, and then we have to educate the larger community, the majority community, that when we have pain, and it might turn, like I say, with kids, it might be in their behaviors that we see the distress. They need to have mental health services. The first line for a kid, a black boy who's in school being seemingly defiant, is not to call the resource officer. Where is the social worker? But then again, and us as clinicians, when we diagnose our children or black children, we need to spend the time with them to get a trauma history. Sometimes we are the ones as clinicians who start this criminalization. We diagnose our kids with ADHD and conduct disorders and oppositional defiant disorders. A lot of people in our community know that those terms. Why? Because we give their children those labels.
Right.
When I go and I see a child, I spend time with them, 99% of the kids asking, I've had to re-diagnose because I got a trauma history and they're suffering from PTSD or depression.
99%. That's incredible.
Yes. I mean that. I used to consult with the school system here in New Orleans for the kids that the social workers couldn't manage. And the amount, we even had, in the post-disaster era, we had doctors out there labeling our kids with schizophrenia when they had PTSD. They didn't have psychotic symptoms, but as you know happens in PTSD, sometimes you really can't recall as well, you're dissociating, all those things. trauma. You treat trauma with talk therapy. You barely even use the antidepressants unless a child is so agitated. You might use a serotonin reuptake inhibitor. And so our kids, every child I've seen in the system here over the years who was this difficult to treat child was because they were misdiagnosed by our mental health practitioners.
Mm-hmm. And trauma is very, very prevalent in our children by virtue just when they wake up and go outside of their door, they're experiencing trauma. Sometimes they're experiencing trauma right within their homes. And so we, ought to be thinking about in terms of a systems approach, and I'd like to hear your comments about it, how we can begin to have what I would call a collective civic mental health system for our children and our adults.
Mm-hmm. There are times when as Black psychiatrists we used to go outside of our offices and engage more civically. We would do some stuff in school systems, various systems, and to a large extent, just even the young doctors coming up now, the psychiatrists, they have so much debt. They have to be having tours. I have a niece who is a child psychiatrist, and she has to have 2 or 3 jobs to pay off her school loans. So that's part in which we could use some time to do some civic work gratis for free. It's become really, really difficult. I know there are these forces, but we have to, I try to get them to dig a little deeper. Maybe there's one thing you can do a month to help those of us who don't have access to the resources that some of us have had access to. So we're going to have to get that back in our spirits.
Yes. And the re-education of some of our young people, because I did a survey, and I don't know if you recall, I presented it at the American Psychiatric Association, and our younger doctors weren't even willing to use the word racism. They were calling it everything else but. And so I had some concerns about that.
Yeah, I feel like we've lost a couple generations of our Black folks in terms of us. We've passed on the trauma, but we've not passed on what they needed to be resilient, which is knowing the history and knowing understanding the struggle. Like I've heard some of my colleagues are saying after the killing of Ahmaud is, I'm going to have to talk to my Black son and let him know that he just can't do certain things. And I'm thinking we should have been talking to him so he could understand. Why do you're a Black child? Or in other things we're doing, the focus we have, we put so much energy into putting weaves on our head and things sparkly on our nails. We don't have time for that. We're at war. And so I hear a lot of people now, Black people being worried that they can't get to their hairdressers. Well, we have hair on our head. We can work with the hair we have. Why is that what you're worried about during COVID? That now you're going to put yourself at risk to get the things. Why can't we see our own value, our own beauty, and also deal with our own reality? America is racist. It's not trying. None of the systems privilege you. They privilege whiteness. And they also are very destructive to our sense of who we are and our value. And I think when we know that, it doesn't have to be a negative space. In fact, we can get a lot of strength from it if only we would acknowledge our reality and work through it. And I find that the couple generations we've tried to not bother them with the stories that our hurt, our pain. We send them to these white schools. All the things that remove them from the true history of who they are. And so they're like very, very surprised, and I've seen some get really depressed when they go into these white spaces and they don't get treated like a full human being. It's like, well, let me bring you back to blackness. Here we are. And I say that, in a very loving way. I've had to work
who we are until we're in a crisis. The time is going really fast, so I'd like to ask you before we run out of time, what do you see and what would you be willing to prescribe in terms of prescriptive remedies for how we're going to deal with not only this disaster but those that are coming, and they will come in the future? What are your thoughts on the last words that you can give our listening audience that can help them, gird up to get ready for the fight?
Well, I think we have to strengthen ourselves. We have to fortify ourselves. We're going to have to, some basic things. We're going to have to eat better. We're going to have to take care of our mind. We have to tend the garden of our mind. We have to be more mindful. We have to be more present. We have to be also at the same time more gentle and tender with ourselves. And I think when we strengthen the house in which we live, ourselves, then we can help others. So to the overused word, but I'm using it from a position of depth and power, is we have to really care for ourselves. And in so doing, we have to listen to what's happening in our minds. We have to pay attention to our feelings. We shouldn't disregard them. If we need a little help, we should seek that help from licensed professional folks. And we must also recognize that maybe it's a gift. We are not, as human beings, we're part of a collective. For us, the Black collective, we cannot turn our backs on each other. So in addition to nurturing and caring for ourselves, the extent to which we can then offer in a more loving kindness way the capacity to serve and help, we cannot forget that. No matter how we succeed, we always have to look back and bring those of us not so privileged along with us. We must. And in so doing, I think we will begin to rebuild our sense of collectivity or desire and our love to support each other. We need to spend a little less time in distraction. And we know how we distract ourselves with Netflix and all kinds of stuff. We need to be more present with each other and value ourselves and each other. And it will teach us what we need to do, what Black businesses we need to support, how we can help educate, the books our kids need to read. I think if we start with ourselves, bettering ourselves in terms of our physical bodies and our mind, the stronger we will be individually and as people.
Powerful, powerful words. Dr. Shervington, I thank you so much for joining us today with these wonderful words of wisdom. I know I'm going to have to bring you back because we just touched the surface. But I thank you for taking the time to put out this valuable information, and we look forward to having you come back and join us. And I want to say to our listening audience, we're here again every Tuesday with Mindful Moments with Dr. Pat. No fluff, no fluff.
Hi, I'm Attorney Anthony Muhammad. I want to thank everyone out there for staying tuned and listening to WSYP-LP 95.1 Sankofa Radio. Media has never been more consolidated. 6 media giants now control a staggering 90% of